Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Love, Lies, and Betrayal. Let's move to the video. My name is Mary. There's a story I want to tell you. It's about my family, and it's not easy to talk about, but I hope you will listen to me. I was married to Richard for 5 years. In the beginning, Richard was a good man, kind, considerate, and hardworking. He had a son, David. David was 17 years old when I became his stepmother in the early days. There was not much dialogue between David and me. He was usually quiet, so I didn't press him. I thought I should give him time to get used to it. David lived with us because Mother had died when he was a young boy because of Richard's busy work schedule. David and I were often alone at home. I tried to support him. I prepared his meals and tried to make the house feel like a warm home one day. I asked him how school had gone, and David looked at me and simply said, "It was good." He didn't add much, but I smiled and said, "If you ever want to talk, I'm always here." He nodded and went to his room. As time went on, David slowly started to open up to me. He talked about his school, his friends, and other things. It made me happy to communicate with him in this way. I wanted him to feel good, to feel safe. But one day everything started to change. One evening, during dinner, Richard was out of town on business. David looked across the table at me and said, "You're a really good person. You've always been kind to me." He said. I smiled slightly and replied, Of course, David, I care about you." But the seriousness in David's face made me a little uneasy. I felt nervous, although I couldn't understand why. From that moment on, David's behavior changed. He started to spend more time with me. He would sit next to me and watch TV or help me with the housework. I thought this was just a sign of closeness and support, but sometimes the way he looked at me made me feel uncomfortable. I tried to ignore these feelings and thought that everything was normal. One night, Richard was at work late again. David and I were chatting in the living room, and suddenly he started talking about his mother. "I miss her so much," he said. "She was the only one who understood me." I winced. I touched him and said, "I'm sorry, David, but I'm proud of you." He looked at me and asked, "Seriously, really?" I said, "Yes." After that night, David's interest in me became more pronounced. When we spent time together, he became closer to me. If I was out, he would come over and offer to help me. If I was doing something in the kitchen one day, he came into the kitchen while I was cooking and asked, "Do you need help?" "Sure," I said. "You can chop the vegetables." As we worked side by side, after a while, he stopped chopping and looked at me. "Thank you for making this house feel like home," he said. I didn't know what to say at that moment. Those words warmed me, but at the same time made me uneasy. "You're welcome," I said with a smile. But from that day on, David's behavior became more intense. He was always wanting to be near me, trying to get my attention. After a while, David began to find excuses to spend more time with me. He would come to me if I was folding the laundry and ask if I needed help in the kitchen, although this made me feel uneasy. I didn't want to be rude to him, but one day, as I was tidying the living room, he sat down next to me and said, "Mary, you're always so busy. Don't you deserve some rest?" "There is always work to do around the house," I replied, smiling slightly. David got up from his seat and came over to me. "You do so much for us. You make this house feel like a real home." I thanked him inwardly, but at the same time I felt uneasy. However, I tried to focus on his good intentions. Then he touched me lightly on the shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it triggered something inside me. I quickly stepped back and asked David, "What are you doing?" "I have to tell you, I see you as more than a mother," she said, with eyes filled with deep emotion. I felt cold. "David, that's not true. I am your stepmother. We are a family." I said firmly, "I know, but I can't control my feelings," he replied, shaking his head. I quickly left the room and locked myself in my bedroom, my hands shaking. I thought about my commitment to Richard and couldn't understand how David could have developed these feelings throughout that night. I tried to find a solution. I thought about telling Richard, but I decided to keep quiet, hoping it was a mistake or temporary confusion. From that day on, I tried to avoid David as much as possible, keeping our conversation short and avoiding being alone. But David was always trying to say something to make things better or finding excuses to get closer. "Mary, can we please talk? I didn't mean to upset you," and things like that. But every time he did something like that, I would leave the room. One evening, Richard was home and we were all having dinner together. I felt safe. David was quiet, but I could feel his presence. I kept my eyes on him, but I didn't want to look at him. I focused on Richard and tried to do something after dinner. Richard went home as usual. I stayed in the kitchen to study, and while I was cleaning up, David came in and stood next to me. I pretended not to notice the door. "Mary?" he said softly. I didn't answer. I continued washing the dishes. "Please, Mary," he said. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean what I said before." I turned quick, and said, "David, I don't want to talk about it." I told him it was wrong, and that we shouldn't go on like this. "I don't know how to make it stop," David said with regret. For the first time, I really noticed the distress in his eyes. He was struggling. He didn't want to hurt me. He was just confused. "This is not good for you," I said. "You have to find a way. You have to pull yourself together." I told him he was a smart and kind man. He had his whole life ahead of him. He nodded but didn't say anything. Then he went out in the kitchen. I took a deep breath. My hope had risen a little. Maybe this was the end of everything, but unfortunately, it wasn't. A few days later, Richard had to leave home for a business trip. I was left alone with David, but I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't control myself. Should I tell Richard about it? What would he think? What should I do? One evening, David knocked on my bedroom door. He said, "Mary, can I talk to you?" I said quietly, "I want to go to bed." David was silent for a while, then he opened the door and came in slowly. He sat down next to me. His eyes were full of that same indecision. He didn't dare look into my eyes, but the sadness in his voice touched me deeply. "Mary, I just don't want to hurt you. I shouldn't keep doing this, but I can't get over you," he said, spiration in his voice. I was silent for a moment. My heart was racing, something was breaking inside me, but at the same time I felt sorry for him. "David, look," I said, taking a deep breath, "this isn't right for either of us. We're losing ourselves. We just have to end it somehow." David shook his head, "But how everything has gotten more complicated," he said, his voice lowering even more. I couldn't bear to see him suffer so much, but at the same time, I knew I had to do the right thing. "I can help you," I said, but something inside me made me question every moment. "But before we can do that, we need to get you and me out of this predicament." David got up quietly and walked to the door. "Maybe I don't need to talk to you, but I still think about you a lot." "Mary," he said. Closing the door behind him at that moment, I felt empty inside. I had tears in my eyes, but I couldn't understand what I was feeling. On the one hand, I felt sorry for him, but on the other hand, I felt lost in the situation. What should I say to Richard? What would happen to him? What would happen to me that night? I tossed and turned in my bed. I couldn't sleep. I had 1,000 questions running through my head, and David's face wouldn't leave my eyes. I was in such a difficult situation that I found myself doing neither right nor wrong. I didn't know what to do, which path to take in the morning. I had the gnawing feeling that everything was going to get more complicated with Richard's departure on the one hand. I was afraid of losing him on the other. I was trying to cope with the ambivalence I felt towards David, no matter how angry I was with him. My pity for him never wavered. One day in the afternoon, Richard came home early from work. There was a chill between us, but I smiled at him as usual, trying to make sure he didn't notice anything. But something was unsettling me. Inside, Richard's eyes were kind and loving as always. But at that moment, it was hard for me to understand how sincere he was. The confusion inside me was eating me up. I continued to make my coffee in the kitchen while Richard went into the living room and turned on the television for a moment. I was overwhelmed by my thoughts, and then I heard his voice. "Mary, something's going on, isn't it?" Richard said, looking at me. "No, everything is fine," I said, averting my eyes. But the uneasiness I felt inside made the words unconvincing. Richard looked at me a little more intently but continued to watch the TV without asking any more questions. At that moment, I felt guilty that maybe he hadn't told me more, but at the same time I thought how difficult it would be to tell Richard the truth. My eyes were searching David's face again, his indecision affecting me even more deeply. I couldn't figure out what to do with the questions swirling madly in my head. I was torn between these complicated feelings about David and my loyalty to Richard that day. I waited for a moment for David to come back to me and tell me something. but the moment never came. I felt that everything had to come to a conclusion. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Don't forget to click the notification bell icon to stay notified.